Lisbeth and then Stephen.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Mark. And although you didn't want to compliment the statistics on the board, I have a question about the methods. And it's specifically, I seem to have understood that you use talk as an independent variable in the social studies.
Yeah.
In this analysis. Talk, whether it should be conceptualized as a mediating variable, and that relates to the question as why we talk regression analysis, as we seem to understand from your table, and not some kind of, which seems much more helpful in this context, not what you call structural evaluation. Or is that coming? And if yes, what's the theoretical role?
Yeah, I try to do it in 15 minutes as simple as possible, but we have also done that kind of analysis, and then what we can see is, I mean, in terms of as an intermediate variable, we can see, for example, that there seems to be interesting relation between family climate, I mean, because we also measure the various relations from a more social psychological point of view, the relations in the family. So we can see that it seems to be the case that the communication climate and the relations between the parents and the kids in the family seems to influence the existence of political talk, which then is related to, for example, political interest, etc. And of course, when we only have this first wave of cross-sectional data, you can you can play with what is independent and dependent, etc. And at least we can see, I think we can argue from this analysis that political talk among peers, both face-to-face and via the web, seems to be a crucial thing in civic engagement. But if it's an independent, we have to wait, I think, for the more the longitudinal data in order to do that. I don't know if it was a good answer to your question, but I agree that.
Okay, thank you. Next question, Stephen.
Yes. Well, I've got a more conceptual question for you, Matt, and also one for Stephen. And I think the conceptual question about what is fantastic project, very important project, is how you distinguish between what you call political talk and non-political talk. I mean, that's a question. How do you make that distinction? Because it seems to me that there isn't a clear distinction. And in fact, that you might see political talk as simply a mode of talking about almost any object. That is to say, it's a mode of talking in which disagreement occurs and justification is required. That's how I would define political talk. But that's not necessarily talking about what's on the news. No. It could be talking about whether somebody in the soap opera should have been kinder to his wife. Yeah. So that's my question for you. I was really intrigued by this presentation about failure. I think we need far more research about failure. Although, of course, this problem will take place in the United Kingdom, where I come from. A team of civil servants right now would be halfway through writing the report on why it was a success. Swedish are more googling people than what I'm really interested in is really a conceptual question for you, which is, what do we mean by failure? I mean, I suppose what we mean in sort of functional terms is some sort of expectation hasn't been realised. But I want to get behind that and ask you, well, why are the expectations there? What is driving these expectations? Why should we have expected, why should anyone have expected these things to have happened? And that is not incidentally to say that I don't share in any aspect of what might be such an expectation, but I'm interested in interrogating where the expectation, what is the structure of the expectation out of which notions of failure and success arise.
Yeah, should I comment?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but of course you're right, and the question of about failure, and I think absolutely that you're right, and you have to, I mean, and I have to think through it. But I have also looked at some other kind of similar institutional projects in Second Life. For example, the Swedish Embassy, which was also launched in 2007, which is also there today, which is also empty, which also had very few visitors, for example. And when you talk to the Swedish Institute who administrated the Swedish Embassy, they would absolutely not talk about it as a failure. They claim that this is the largest success ever for some reason, especially economic, due to the press coverage that they got and so on. So that is of course also a matter of rhetorics on how you want to put it to the world what you have been doing. But when I discussed this as a failure, I was actually both taking. I mean, listening to the media discourse describing it as a failure, but it was also due to the fact that I have tried to get back to the people at the Malmö administration, to the people at Sweden Island, which was the company that built the entire Malmö island and administrated it, and to some other people that have been involved in the project, and they have all. No one wants to even talk about it. I got the smallest final report ever from the Malmö administration, but when I tried to ask questions about it, they just feel very embarrassed about the entire project. So that's why I framed it in the failure frame, so to speak.
Yeah, that it's a really good and tough question about what is political talk and how to measure various dimensions or various understandings of what is political talk. And I really agree that it would have been great if we could move more into the way of talking rather than the topic. But at the same time, it has to work in it's really a challenge to develop items in such a study that also are reliable and works. So we decided to, after a number of pilot studies, we decided to broaden this concept of politics, because we can see that, of course, young people associate with, when you are asking about politics, they say, I'm not interested in politics, but on the other hand, I'm interested in these questions, and we know about that. So the term also is associated with specific understandings of quite limited. But what we try to do, at least, is that we have a number of items asking not only about politics, but also if they talk about societal questions, if they talk about environmental questions, so trying to broaden it in that way, but not in the way you suggest. We haven't managed to do that.
Thank you. Next question. Yep.
My question is for Bart. I'm wondering about, within these articles that you've been looking at in terms of violence, one thing that seems interesting or important to me is this question of, when is violence legitimate, both on the part of the protesters, but also, for example, on the part of the police. So you can have an article that might have balance in terms of 50-50, who was violent, what were the acts, but then the question is, why was the violence used? And I mean, the example I thought about when I was growing up in Britain was the miners' strike in the 1980s, a particularly famous case where there was a clip showing miners attacking the police and the police responding, and then it came out later that the video had been edited and it was actually reversed. The police had attacked the miners first, and the miners then responded to that violence. So in that particular case, that's an example of when is violence legitimate. Well, it depends on context. So I'm wondering, in the article that you looked at, if in any way this question of legitimation and this idea about, when is the use of state violence legitimate, or even the use of violence on the part of protesters if they're being kettled, if they're feeling attacked, if they're responding. I'm just wondering if that's part of it as well, because the proportion of coverage in terms of who is being violent is one thing, but when and why is an important question.
Most articles would focus either on the violence of protesters or on the violence of police. So they're very, especially in the left-wing media, you will find more balanced reports. the violence as such is described in various ways, both in all media at times very negative, as kind of thugs, I mean certainly in the right-wing media, thugs, mobs, the hijack frame of anarchists coming from abroad to destabilize the country. Then there's also a frame that puts that violence in relation to the students more in a passion frame and or even as banter, kind of teenage behavior. And in some of the right-wing media, you will also find some, I wouldn't say positive, but a kind of understanding of the frustration but then again also rejecting violence as such as a legitimate means to express yourself or as a form of political talk in a sense, which for these students it sometimes was because of having a sense of not being heard.
Okay, next question.
Yeah, for really terrific presentations, time is short, so a quick question to Fredrik and to Bart. Fredrik, there's sometimes when one reads Dewey, you get a sense of this kind of cozy quality, and I was wondering in the actual settings of Lund, are there like drawn out conflicts and fights and that kind of sort of intensive debate?
They're quite intensive debates, but not so much. Well, there can be between the youngsters as well during those big meetings because they handle a lot of money. They're given approximately 10,000 euros each year at least. The municipality gives them that amount of money to handle themselves, to initiate and carry on their projects. And they have to apply for those money, the young people. And they have to argue for them. And it's all settled with votes. Obviously, there can be kind of quite intense debates.
It's not just massive consensus.
Yes, right. But it's it is very consensus based, at least among the young involved in the project, but not necessarily between the politicians and officials and the young. There can be kind of hard discussions and debates. And I missed to take that example. One example of how the success of this project was expressed was that the young people wanted a culture house of their own, and they actually worked very hard through those debates and arguments and so on for 5 or 6 years or something like that, in order to get this cultural house. And eventually the politicians gave up and said, okay, here's $1 million and the house, and now they have it. So well, it is by dialogue. That is the principle they use.
Yeah, and quickly, I was wondering, to what extent do you know anything about whether the activists groups had any prior communication with the mainstream media, so priming them, inviting a particular angle in the coverage?
That's especially, well, there are two answers to that. On the one hand, yes, in the sense that especially The Guardian was, compared to all the other publications, quite positive towards the student and gave them a lot more space. And it was also most of the articles were from The Guardian. So there you see